You know, the turn is one of those spots where it's really tempting to be too timid because you'd rather have a better hand, right? To bluff, you'd rather have that flush draw, that straight draw, some sort of blocker effect. It's easy to make excuses for passivity on the turn, but today I'm here to bring you 3 spots where almost all of you watching are too passive, and getting aggression into your game in these situations, it opens the door to just playing a much higher caliber of poker. Let's meet the spots. So this is a spot where I don't think people are aggressive enough on the turn. We open the Queen Jack offsuit here. There's a recreational player in the small blind. This is a mixed open at equilibrium. King 8-3 rainbow is a flop that you can bet all of your range on, and it's not a simplification to do so. Sometimes people say, I'm going to range bet here to simplify my strategy, but this is indeed just 100% in a solver. Villain calls and we get the 4 of spades turn. So when we think about what this turn really does, it preserves our nut advantage incredibly well. Our nutted region on the flop is stuff like king, queen plus, things that we have at higher frequency than the opponent does. The opponent being incentivized here to raise pocket 8s and pocket 3s at a very high frequency on flop. This turn doesn't negate that at all. It doesn't really hit our bad hands. It doesn't hit our flop air, so to speak. And so this is a situation where villain is more condensed and more mediocre, and we're more polarized. Equity-wise, he's going to be a slight favorite range versus range. But when it comes to EV, it'll be much closer because our nut advantage just entitles us to so much of the pot with those really good hands. And therefore, we're not in a bad world. This is not what the Carrot Poker School would deem an unfavorable world. This is like a neutral world with a big nut advantage. And in those spots, you can simplify to playing very big sizes, and you don't have to be massively selective with your bluffing criteria. So obviously there are hands here that we would rather have, right? We would rather have ace-6 of spades. We'd rather have 5-6. We'd rather have some sort of draw that gives us more and better quality outs than this hand does. But what this hand offers is far from nothing. And this is the point that's missing in so many of the thought processes of the people I've coached over the years. What's going on here with our hand? Why is it permissible to bluff this? Because this is actually a pure bluff at equilibrium, believe it or not, if you simplify to an overbet only strategy. Well, a lot of villain's turn continuing range here is going to be an 8. Some of it will probably be a 3. Not all of it's going to be a king, basically. A king is only a reasonable part of it. It's not everything. And so because you have 2 overcards to 9s, 10s, 8x, etc., there are branches of the tree here where this gets called and you bink the river. And while that bink doesn't entitle you to a ton of the pot, it entitles you to enough of the pot because sometimes villain has a hand like this. Now, this hand shouldn't really call out of the small blind, but because we're against a recreational player, we're going to examine a sim that's actually under the gun against big blind, because I think the big blind range is more representative of what people show up with here. Back to the turn, though, for a second, before we look at that. This hand has the jack of spades. That means that we're blocking 8x of spades, which is the pure continue. It means that we're blocking some ace-jack of spades pure continues. We're blocking some flush draws that might raise us at some frequency, like the queen-jack of spades or jack-10 of spades or something. When we overbet, that's probably not so likely to happen, but still. And the other thing this card does, being a spade, is that when we hit the jack on the river, it can't be a spade because we have the spade, so our pair draw is a bit more pure there. It allows us to continue to win against all of the flush draw combos. We also block a bit of king X with this, and while we might block a few folds with the queen of diamonds, because it blocks some hand like ace queen of diamonds that just call the flop, we will also unblock most of the folding range. The jack of spades isn't going to block a lot of that. So overall, this is an okay candidate for the world that we're in. And if we consult the solver here for a second, what we actually find is that hands like this can be pure on the turn. When you have that spade is to some extent important. It's not a negligible blocker effect. There are some other hands though in this sim that are really key finds. Like if you bet here with ace-6 of hearts, you're overbetting only in this sim, by the way. That's what I've locked it to. You might think, well, that's just air. How can you overbet absolute trash? And the answer is that you can't overbet absolute trash. But very few hands in your under the gun range here are absolute trash, because a lot of them have something going. So when you have that live ace, when you have that overcard, when villain calls you with a king on the turn and you hit the ace, not only do you hit the best hand most of the time, but you hit a value bettable hand. Your opponent's not got 5 deuce here. He's not hitting a straight on the ace. He's not got naked ace high for calling turn. With the exception of things like ace 3 and ace 8, you're going to hit the nuts on an ace river. The ace is an incredibly pure nutty card, but it doesn't appear that way because it's a pair draw. It's not a flush draw. But actually, when you bet the turn with jack 10 of spades here and get called, sometimes you get flush over flush. You very rarely get top pair over top paired here when you bet the turn with an ace and get called. So there are plenty of hands in this sim that I think are deeply counterintuitive, but you can overbet them at equilibrium. And if you do think your opponent's folding too often, by folding a hand like 10-8 always or something like that, or 9-8 always, then you're going to want to go ahead and start overbetting these hands pure, and then maybe even find some other overbets as well. The way this hand actually played out, as we saw, was that we overbet the turn, villain called, and the river came the jack of hearts and it went check, check. The weirdest thing about a spot like this is that when you get to the river, it's at this point in the hand where you might lose control of your bluffing. Because when your opponent's called your turn overbet, and the river's come a jack, it's not a card that's made you a ton of new nutted hands, nor is it a card that's paired that many of your bluffs, although some of your bluffs have reached showdown value. You're going to have to be a little bit careful with your frequency on the river here. So when you're checked to here, a lot of these hands that were overbetting the turn, the default with them is now just to give up. And as you can see, the solver's just being quite picky about the combos it uses. There are certain combos it believes are pure, but overall here, you're going to have to keep your bluff frequency in check because you've reached one of these triple barrel nodes where your turn bet got called. And there are some river cards that bail you out enough that you can just auto bluff these rivers, but in most rivers where your turn overbet gets called, many of your turn bluffs are going to be naturally give ups here. So we're not saying be a mindless maniac, just barrel, 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 and don't worry about it. We're saying look for less obvious drawing hands on the turn that have decent properties and make sure you get some aggression in with them. And then river is a new street, it's a new node, it's not part of the same decision. You don't want to story weave in poker where you say, well, if we're bluffing the turn, we have to bluff the river and starting to tie nodes together irrationally. It doesn't make sense. All right, let's meet another spot where I don't think you guys are, by and large, aggressive enough on the turn. So this next spot is about having a really strong range that doesn't have natural air combinations in it, but a very bad hand. This is similar to episode number 2 of True EV, which is all about when you have a disgustingly bad part of what is overall a really strong range. So this is 100 zoom and there's an open. We go ahead and 3-bet 6s on the button. This is a board that you can bet all of your range on. You can use some bigger bets here. The simplest way to play this situation is just to use small ones. Villain calls, and we get the jack of clubs turn. So when you look at this spot, you might be thinking, we have a terrible hand. We have very bad redraw. The only thing we're drawing to is 2 outs. And very early on in your poker career, right? You're kind of conditioned to scoff in the face of 2 outs. You're taught not to chase gut shots, not to draw to sets after the flop. Drawing to a set after the flop sounds like something a tilted fish would do, right? But that's not what you're doing here. This is bailout equity, and it's very nutted live bailout equity. Your opponent doesn't really have jacks, queens, or kings in this node. So unless villain has ace 10 or 10-9 suited only, you're going to be live with the 6 out on the river. So it's a bit like the last hand where we saw the ace bluffing the turn because its outs are incredibly valuable on the river. So poker's a game of magnitude and frequency, and that the frequency you hit a set at here is very low, but the magnitude of how good that is for you is very high. For example, if someone said to you, buy this lottery ticket for £1 or $1 and it will win 1% of the time and you win 50 million. That's an insanely profitable bet because although the frequency is low, the magnitude is so great and the cost is so small that you have to do it. Now you might be thinking, well, if we bluff this turn, the cost isn't small because we're going to bet some reasonable sizing, but the fold equity is there to bail us out. There are many parts of villain's calling range here on the flop that will fold the turn. Because if villain just has some mediocre hand here, like 9s, they're going to fold the turn. If they have a hand like a bad gutter plus draw, that's not doing very well against our range here. It's, you know, drawing very thin a lot of the time. A lot of the time, villain can't draw to 2 pair and things like that here, or even trips. So a lot of their outs that are normally live on safer textures are dead. And so this demands quite a lot of folding hands that look reasonable at equilibrium. Now the bluff with sixes, the idea is that we have practically no showdown value with this hand in real life. We have none. And in theory, we're not meant to have any either. And therefore, checking and going to the river and playing the river is just never going to be that high EV a node. And so bluffing the turn doesn't have to be either. And there's enough going on here to make this okay. And furthermore, and most importantly, if you don't find bets like this with the pocket sixes with the club is the solver's deal breaker. It's you know, sort of, that's the deciding factor that makes it okay in the solver's mind to bluff here, because one of your outs is completely pure and never making your opponent a flush. But both of your outs are, whereas if you only had the six of hearts and six of diamonds, then the six of clubs would be, in some sense, a reverse implied odds card against some of your opponent's range. So the solver thinks the six of clubs is the be all and end all here, but I think the most important part of this is the principle that when your range is really strong and you're in a spot like this, you've got to find your bluffs from somewhere. And if you think sixes is weird, the solver's also going to bluff something like nines or tens in this node or jack 10. It's going to reach pretty far up into its showdown value, because the more redraw you have, the better, and you are making your opponent fold some hand like ace queen here when you bet the turn, at least in theory. Against some calling station, you might not do so well, and I do think it's a known fact that recreational players are over-defending messy turn cards like this because they're not adjusting enough to the relative hand strength that they actually acquire with a hand like ace queen on this run out. Let's take a quick look at the sim now, and I'll show you a bit further what I mean. So this is a little bit of a geeky aspect of the hand, but the pot here is 273 chips in the sim at the point where we have the chance to bet the turn, and our pot share is 147 chips, so I'm no arithmetic genius, but I can see that that is more than half of the pot, right, in pot share, and that's because our range is just amazingly strong here. Even though we filtered villain, even though villain has had to, you know, on the flop, start shedding and folding all of their really bad hands, like their underpairs for the most part and that kind of thing, and their range has strengthened, it's still the case on this card that us being in position with this big nut advantage is going to give us an EV edge. So although we're a dog here in terms of equity, range versus range equity, we're a favourite in terms of EV because of all of the excess money that these green hands here are entitled to. Now, sixes is a very low EV hand, but it's very low EV regardless of what we do. If we bet, it's low EV. If we check, it's low EV. And so at some frequency, the solver's happy betting here with the six of clubs, with the seven of clubs, or any sevens combo. It seems to think the hand is pure. To me, this is kind of solver noise to say that we're allowed to bluff with sevens, no club, but we can't bluff with sixes, no club. Is there any real reason for that you guys can see? I don't see an obvious one. And so I like to just chalk that up to, I don't really care. So even if I had sixes with no club here, would I be saying that this is a mistake to bet the turn, that we should have waited for the club? No, because then we end up just in this confused world where we're trying to copy the solver. And remember, that's never the ethos that we have here at Carrot Corner. We're never trying to imitate solvers like slaves to their every specific whim, but rather we're trying to grasp the broad strokes of what's going on, which is that when you're in a favourable world for your range, where you have a monopoly on big nutted hands and you're in position, and your opponent's range is more capped and struggling, you can go ahead and bluff with impunity with hands that don't look that good. So you can see that we're reaching up into the realms of Jack 9, pocket 10s. Okay, Jack 10 it deems a bit too live. I think it doesn't really want to get raised with that hand. Same with Queen 10, just a bit high up now, a bit too live. So there is a checking medium here. There's a part of the range that's happy just going to river. But yeah, the thing is that when we start betting here, it's the B60 I picked, similar to my sizing in game. Villain is pure folding ace-jack, folding ace-queen quite a lot. If you look at their range, they just really don't have that many nutty hands compared to us. They're very few. And so, if you do get called here, and you jam the river, let's say that you get a brick river, right? Like the deuce of hearts, and you go ahead and jam it. Far from them being allowed to fold one pair now, they actually now at this point in the hand have to find bluff catches with Queen 10, King 10, they have to slow play ace 10 on the turn. It gets pretty difficult. I guess ace queen is blocking more bluffs with the ace, but we see the trend here. So how to distill this lesson, how to take this away and use it in your own game? Look out for situations where the board is incredibly hard for you to miss. We've got not that many bad hands and lots of good hands, and look to attack a lot in those situations. One thing that surprises me here is that the solver's doing so much checking with ace-x here. And as we saw, villain's main folding range is ace-jack and ace-queen. This is what we call a blocker anomaly. Because it's a small range spot that's very specifically tailored to these big cards being on the board and Broadway combos in particular, because the pairs went away on the flop, right? They're gone. We saw that in response to the flop c-bet. So because this is a very unique spot here, what we're seeing is that villain's folding range is almost exclusively going to be ace-x here with the combinatorically abundant stuff. And so we actually shy away from bluffing with an ace, and we bluff more hands that unblock the folding range down here. This is getting a little bit solvery, a little bit too nitty-gritty, but hopefully you guys can see why so many people fail to apply enough pressure in these spots with a really weak hand and a really strong range. Let's have a look at one more spot now that embodies this turn passivity that's holding so many of you back. Wait, what's that? What do you mean? Why I didn't show them the result? No, I don't want to show them the result. Well, what's it got to do with anything? Sorry guys, it's my producer on the phone. No, I don't want, I've been over this before. I don't want to keep showing them the result of the hand because it's nothing to do with the point we're making. Can I just continue rolling, please? What do you mean I have to? Okay, no, you're the boss. No, as you like. Yeah, no, I'll show the result of the hand. It's fine. I just don't see the point. God, honestly, sick of this shit. Absolutely sick of this shit. Right, guys, you'll want to see the result of the hand. So off we go. This is very important. It has everything to do with the teaching. Villain folded. Now on to the next spot. Okay, so this is a spot that uses the big bet in theory rather than the overbet. And I want to teach you guys why that is in case you don't know already. You may well already understand this. So it's another one of these range bet situations where it's not a stretch to just bet all of your range for third pot at all, or quarter pot, whatever you want to use. Villain peels here and we get the 7 of diamonds turn. And this situation, when I look at this, my first thought is we don't have that many flush or straight draws, so many of our bluffs have to come from pair draws. We're not going to use overbets is my second thought because King X is mixed at equilibrium on the flop here. It's not always raised. And because of that, if you start overbetting and then jamming the river and stuff, villain very quickly just falls into a very easy to apply strategy where they're no longer indifferent and their King X is just plainly winning the most triple barrel sizes and double barrel sizes. All double barrel sizes, actually. And then some other hands are just very foldable by the river. And you don't want to push your opponent into a realm where they have loads of winning calls, then everything else is just losing. Because you're not maximizing EV strategy versus strategy if they can play that way. So instead you want to use a smaller bet because you lack the nut advantage as purely on this texture. Like, okay, you have more ace king. But the thing is here that this spot's not really about who has more ace king. It's about who has a king. Because when you have a king, you have such a profound blocker effect on the opponent's range that it doesn't really... Hold on, guys, sorry. No, we're going to talk about blockers when it matters. No, I didn't say that. I didn't say we were never going to talk about blockers. I didn't say they never matter. I said they don't matter in many of the situations. I'm sorry, can you stop interrupting me? I just want to finish the video. Okay, I'll say the disclaimer. Guys, blockers, a lot of the time, don't really matter. But in certain situations, they preside over a bigger percentage of the opponent's range than others. And this is one where they matter more, okay? But please don't think that I think blockers are the driving force behind everything. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks. So in this situation, we need some bluffs of this ilk. Having the 9 of clubs and the queen of spades, this feels like, blocker-wise, if we want to get really specific, we'd rather have hearts, right? And we'd rather have diamonds. We'd rather have diamonds because diamonds raise us at some frequency, and that sucks. And we'd rather not have clubs or spades because we unblock the backdoor floaty hands like queen jack of clubs, 10-9 of spades, etc. The times that they didn't choose to raise the flop, they will often do that. And so not having a heart here is kind of bad. The heart's kind of like the gin suit in a sense because you still get to block a king, like a suited king, and you get to unblock the folding range at the same time. The club has to be like the worst card. Does that mean that you should be wary about bluffing this hand. At equilibrium, it probably does. I've not run the sim, I don't know, but we'll take a look in a minute. It probably means that we just favor other suits here. In real life, though, I want to go out on a limb and say, I think this is an overfolded spot. I think like the really dry turn spots like this are very overfolded at low stakes, and even at 100, or this is 200 zoom actually, this hand, but I think they're overfolded even in some games like this, because one, you've got to resist raising the king quite often on the flop in order to have it, and secondly, you've got to call the turn with some hands that look pretty bad. Let's take a look at this. We'll see what the solver thinks of this hand, but the general point is pair draws, pair draws, pair draws. Bluff with pair draws, especially when you have two overs to other stuff in the opponent's range, but obviously don't overbet this texture. It's not the right one. Okay, so I just simmed it. On the turn, there are certain combos that are pure of Queen 9. It really likes Queen 9, by the way. It just thinks it's a really live pair draw hand with useful blockers to the King X and continuance range of the opponent. You can see that even when you have the bad suits at the top right there, even when you have that combo like we did, I believe that was our combo, or maybe it was Queen of Clubs, 9 of Spades, it was one of those, you're still allowed to bet. And it's just so easy to come up with reasons here to not bet all of these juicy pair draw hands. I remember for a while my friend Sam would say, Pete's obsessed with pair draws, it's all he ever talks about. But when I was making the Carrot Poker School, I really focused on this because I found so many opportunities where just having two good pair draws was like a deal breaker. If you look at Queen 5 here, you can see that there is such a thing as a hand that's too bad in terms of redraw and in terms of blocker properties to bet the turn with in theory. But that hand has to get really bad. It has to score really low in multiple different criteria, like the Queen 5 of Clubs. That's not blocking a king that's suited, because the King of Clubs is on board. It's blocking some backdoor floaty hands, like the Queen X of Clubs. And it has only one good pair draw that's an overcard to something like sixes. The 5 is still an overcard to the 4, though. And then you can see that like the other suits of these are just totally fine to be betting with at a decent frequency. The spade being better than the club because you can block a suited king with a spade but not with the club when it comes to Queen 5 or something like that. So some fascinating stuff here. Most of your bluffs are coming from hands that you probably just don't bet enough with, like how many of you are betting 10-8 of hearts at that frequency. And this allows you to exploit as well, because if you think about it, if you face a bet on this turn at 50 NL, let's say you're 50 NL grinder, aspirations to play 100 soon, something like that. It's probably a lot of you watching are around that level. What do you do here when you face a bet on this turn and you have sixes, right? Solver says you should call. But if you fold, you lose nothing. Basically, okay, you lose a fair bet. I misread that. You lose like almost a full big blind. So maybe sixes isn't the hand to fold, but threes, let's say. If you have threes, and you have the right suit of threes because you have the diamond, maybe you should still fold, right? Maybe you should get tight on this node. If you have a mix here, like you have ace jack, which is a break-even call, maybe you should just fold here. If you have ace 10, maybe you should just fold here. This is probably not a spot to go messing around with villain, because villain is entitled to bluff so many of these pair draw hands that it's almost obscene to me, and it's almost like inevitable to me that the population is under bluffing this node at like 50 NL, for example. So there's a lot of ramifications of this. One, you're probably not bluffing enough on this node, but secondly, neither your opponents, and you should definitely try to react to that. Overall, this is just a really misplayed node. So in game here, when I bet the turn, I also expect it to be overfolded, right? So villain's meant to call here with ace jack at high frequency. He's meant to never fold sixes. He's meant to call threes sometimes. This is one of these spots where neither player appreciates fully the dryness of the texture and how hard it is to hit, and ends up under defending. So here's a rule to finish up with for today. When textures are really hard to miss, like we saw earlier, people are going to over-defend, especially recreational players who aren't able to adapt to their relative hand strength properly, that are stuck in the mindset of absolute hand strength and vague patterns. However, when a texture is really hard to hit, and it's super dry and there's tons of just random air floating around and ace high and queen high and stuff like that, the spot's usually going to be overfolded because you have to take a hand like ace jack high and call again on this turn. So not only is this bet a fine thing to do at equilibrium that people very often miss, but it's actually an imperative thing to do at a stake like 25 NL, where this turn is egregiously overfolded. And that brings us towards the end of this video. If you like the way we teach the game at Carrot Corner, we've just launched a subscription service. We have 22 videos available right now. We're adding 3 every Monday. Carrot Corner coach James Shea was the latest pro to drop on there. He's made a cool video about pre-flop and how to exploit and gain some extra low-hanging fruit for an edge there. And he's also done a couple of videos about how to beat 50 NL as a chosen stake for him to do play, and explains that for a while. So hope you'll enjoy that, and do let me know in the comments what you think about this sort of format where we alternate between hand review and solver. And let me know, how many of these aggressive actions are you finding? What's this video going to do? What are you going to change in future? Alright guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.